Good morning, fam. Just wanted to share a short devotion with you. It's out of James 2:23. I'm gonna call this one "Friend of God" because we're gonna look at different aspects and prerequisites to being a friend of God. We'll start here in James chapter 2 and verse 23. It says, "And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." And so I think sometimes we think about it and we say, okay, being a friend of God, how can we as men or women, attain a friendship with God? Even David says, "What is a man that you are mindful of him?" And, a lot of times it seems like it's an impossible thing. But one thing we don't realize is that God desires to be friends with us. You think about it and you think about what qualities or attributes you look for in a friend: faithfulness, loyalty. Even as I was thinking about some of these things, you think about what kind of friend do you want, and then you have to be that kind of friend. And so, if you want a loyal friend, let's be loyal to God. You want to be a faithful friend, be faithful to God. You want a loving friend, one who's going to look out for your best interest, one that's going to protect you, all these different things. And let's apply those things to our friendship with God. Let's look at James chapter 4 and verse 8. He says, "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded." And so a lot of times we feel like we're so far from God. One thing we don't realize, it's not that God has removed himself from us, because God is always with us, but that we've removed ourselves from God. I just want to read this quote from Dr. Oswald Sanders. It was very convicting because, a lot of times we hear people and we see people that are closer to God than others. And a lot of people, you ask them, "Hey, how's your relationship with God?" "Oh, it's very, very bad. We're not doing that good, this and that." And they have all these excuses. But one thing we don't realize is that, what Dr. Oswald Sanders says, each of us is as close to God as we choose to be. So our relationship with God is we're not a victim of circumstances. It's not like, oh, it hailed today, so me and God aren't doing so good today. It's that I choose to be far from God. And if we're close to God, it's because that's where we choose to be. And so, I just want you guys to think about that as you, examine your own lives, because the purpose of these messages are not just to, for information, but to examine ourselves and see where we're at and see if that's where we want to be. And if not, let's start making the necessary changes, whether it's choices or direction or whatever it is, and start moving in that right direction. And so just keep that in mind. Each of us is as close to God as we choose to be. Next thing we're going to look at is Isaiah 41. Isaiah 41 and verse 8. He says, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, I have chosen, the descendants of Abraham, my friend." And so we see here that Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the descendants of Abraham, my friend. And so God chooses. So we see here a mutual affection. We see a mutual affection for God and us. So it's not just that we desire God, but God also desires us. He says, "You," verse 9, "you who I have taken from the ends of the earth and called from its furthest region, and said, 'You are my servant, I have chosen you and have not cast you away. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand.'" So another prerequisite is first of all, we have to, obviously have to be saved. We have to be born again. We have to believe in the one and only Son of God. So we see earlier, we read in James that Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Therefore, he was called a friend of God. And so another prerequisite is faith. If we don't have faith, we can't be a friend of God. It doesn't say what what kind of faith, because we see that each person has a different measure of faith. And so it's not about the abundance, but when God says something, we're to believe it. We see the next thing that's a prerequisite is being a servant of God. You know, there's no way we can't skip servanthood. And so one thing we got to realize is that even if we're a friend of God, we're also a servant of God. So just think about this. Imagine you being friends with the king. Say we were in Israel back in that time, and David was king. We can be a friend to David, but that doesn't change his position as being king, having sovereign reign and rule in all the land. And the same thing with us and God is that, you know, we can be friends with God, but he's still king. He's still Lord. He still has sovereign reign and rule. We're still servants and we're still subject to him. And so you even think about it, it's like, well, how can I be friends with the king? Well, it is possible. Same thing with us being friends with God. So we see that's the next thing is servanthood. And so one thing we got to realize too is that everybody's serving God is going to look different. You might look at me and say, oh, well, you know, I probably couldn't do that. Well, it's easy for me because I'm working within the gifts and the talents that God has gifted me with. And so it's not hard for me. And the same thing for you. I might look to you and say, well, how can that person show mercy or hospitality or gifts of helps or administration or whatever gift God has given you? And that's my weakness. And I'm like, well, I can't work within that. That's impossible for me, or that's a very difficult thing for me to do. But one thing we got to realize is that everybody's servanthood towards God looks different. Some people are in part-time ministry, some people are in full-time ministry. Everyone's calling is different. So one thing we need to do is we need to ask God what he's given us, the gift that he's given us, the talents that he's given us, and then also how we can use them to bring glory to him and to further his kingdom. And then once you're operating in the gifts and the talents which God has given you, it's a gift and it's a talent. So it's not going to be very difficult for you to do. Obviously, it's going to take some discipline. It's going to take some effort, but you're not going to be striving to do it. And so just want to encourage you on that we are to serve God. And so, like I said, everyone is going to be different. Next verse we're going to look at is Isaiah 37, verse 35. We see here, God says, "For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake." And so the context here is where the Assyrians were coming against King Hezekiah and in Israel. And we see here that the Assyrians, there was many that were very mighty. They began explaining how these Assyrians are mocking the Jews, saying, "Hey, look, you guys are. If we gave you 2,000 horses, you didn't even have the horsemen to put on them. You don't even have the soldiers to fight with us." And so, you know, they're very inadequate, but God fights for them. And God is saying here that I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. And so that's the next thing we see here is that God does things. You know, David had died many years before this, but God is still being good to his children and to his descendants years after. And that's another benefit of being a friend of God, is that God will have mercy and compassion on our descendants far after we're gone. But that also in the context of being a servant of his, because he said here, for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. So us being a servant of God, there's benefits in it. You know, God is going to show mercy to our descendants after. We also know that David was a man after God's own heart. And so we see that there's value in being loyal to God and you know, having a loyal heart towards him and serving him. And the same is true with Abraham. God did things for Abraham because of his friend who we read earlier, because Abraham, whom I've chosen. And so there's benefits in it. We don't do things for the benefits, but we do things because God is worthy. And so we're going to stop there. There's many more things to say regarding being a friend of God, and we're going to have to split this up into a couple of parts, because otherwise it'd be an hour devotion. And so we're going to stop there. Appreciate your time. I want you to do me a favor, please, and subscribe, like, and share this video, and we'll notify you on the next one. Have a great day and God bless.